Welcome back to Untold Revenge Files. Today, the story you're about to hear takes place in Crestwood, California. My name is Nora Whitfield. I'm 31 years old, and I'm standing in a cemetery watching my grandfather's casket sink into the earth, wondering why I even bothered coming home. Let me take you back. I spent 8 years serving as a cryptologist in the United States Navy. 8 years decoding signals, cracking encrypted communications, and sitting inside windowless rooms on ships that rocked through the Pacific while the rest of the world slept. I was good at my job. No, I was exceptional at it. 2 commendations. A classified briefing at the Pentagon when I was only 26, the kind of career most people in my field dream about. But none of that mattered to my father. My dad, Richard Whitfield, was the kind of man who measured people by proximity, not by merit. If you were standing next to him at the country club, you mattered. If you were deployed 6,000 miles away, you didn't exist. And I had made the unforgivable mistake of choosing a life that took me far from his spotlight. Growing up in Crestwood, I was always the quiet one. My older sister Blair was the golden child. Pageants, student council, a degree in marketing from Stanford that my father paid for without blinking. Blair stayed close. Blair attended every dinner, every gala, every fundraiser my father hosted for his tech consulting firm. Blair laughed at his jokes, wore the dresses he approved of, and dated the men he introduced her to. I joined the Navy. The day I told my father I'd enlisted, he set his fork down on his plate, so slowly it didn't make a sound. He looked at my mother, Margaret, who had already retreated behind her wine glass. Then he looked at me and said, "Well, I suppose someone in this family has to learn what disappointment tastes like." That was 17-year-old me, sitting at a dinner table in a house with 9 bedrooms, being told I was a disappointment before I'd even begun. My grandfather, Frank Whitfield, was different. Grandpa Frank had served in Army intelligence during the Cold War. He never talked about it much, but he understood me. He was the one who drove me to the recruiting office. He was the one who called me every Sunday, no matter what time zone I was in. When I made petty officer, he sent me a handwritten letter that said, "The ones who see in the dark are the ones the world needs most. Never stop seeing, Nora." I kept that letter in my locker for 6 years, and then Grandpa Frank died. The funeral was at St. Andrew's in Crestwood. Everyone was there. My father in his charcoal Tom Ford suit. Blair in a black dress that probably cost more than my monthly housing allowance. Cousins, business associates, neighbors. People who barely knew Frank but wanted to be seen grieving a wealthy man. I flew in from Virginia on a red-eye. I wore my service uniform. Nobody hugged me. Before I tell you exactly what my father did next, tell me, what time is it where you are right now, and where are you watching from? I'm really curious to see how far this story will travel. After the burial, we gathered at my father's estate for the reading of the will. Frank's attorney, a silver-haired man named Donald Ashford, sat at the head of the dining room table with a leather portfolio in front of him. My father sat to his right, legs crossed, already calculating. Blair sat beside him, dabbing her eyes with a tissue she hadn't actually used. The will was straightforward at first. The house in Carmel went to Margaret. A trust for Blair's children, shares in 2 holding companies divided among the cousins. My father received a controlling interest in Frank's consulting legacy, a portfolio worth roughly $40 million. Then, Mr. Ashford reached the final item. "To my granddaughter, Nora Elizabeth Whitfield, I leave the contents of this envelope." He slid a thin white envelope across the table. That was it. No property, no shares, no trust. Just an envelope. My father laughed, not loudly, not cruelly even. Just a soft, satisfied chuckle, like a man who had finally been proven right about a bet he'd made years ago. He looked at Blair. Blair looked at her nails. "Well," my father said, leaning back, "I guess Frank finally saw what the rest of us always knew. Some people just aren't worth investing in." My chest went hollow. Not tight. Hollow. Like someone had reached inside me and scooped everything out. I picked up the envelope. My hands were steady. Years of military discipline will do that. You can be dying inside and your hands will still be steady. I opened it in the car. Inside was a single first-class plane ticket to Zurich, Switzerland, departing in 48 hours, and beneath it, a thin metallic card, matte silver, cold to the touch, with a single word laser engraved into its surface: Decrypt. I had no idea that a dead man's final puzzle would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family and change my life forever. I almost didn't go. I sat in my rental car outside my father's estate for 20 minutes, staring at that silver card, turning it over and over between my fingers. Decrypt. It was the kind of word that meant nothing to most people and everything to me. Grandpa Frank knew that. He knew exactly what that word would do to a cryptologist's brain. It would itch. It would pull. It would make sleep impossible until I solved it. So 47 hours later, I was on a plane. Back in Crestwood, my father wasted no time. Blair called me while I was boarding, her voice dripping with that particular sweetness she used when she wanted something. "Nora, Daddy thinks you should let Mr. Ashford hold on to whatever Frank left you. He says it's probably nothing, but just in case there are tax implications, it's better if the family handles it together." Together. That word had never included me before. I told Blair I had to go. I turned off my phone. I landed in Zurich at 6 in the morning, Swiss time. The air was cold and clean, and the mountains in the distance looked like teeth biting into a pale sky. I expected to figure out my next step on my own. I didn't have to. 2 men in dark suits were waiting at the gate, holding a small placard that read simply, "Whitfield." They didn't smile. They didn't explain. They escorted me to a black sedan with tinted windows and drove me through the city's old quarter, past the banks and cathedrals, to a narrow cobblestone street where a building stood with no signage. Just a brass number. 19. Inside, the air smelled like old wood and money. A woman named Elise Vogt, director of private client relations at what I would later learn was one of Switzerland's most discreet private banking institutions, was waiting for me in a room with a single mahogany table and 2 chairs. "Miss Whitfield," she said, extending her hand. "Your grandfather told us you would come. He said you would hesitate, but you would come. He was remarkably precise about you." She asked for the silver card. I handed it over. She placed it on a scanner embedded in the table's surface. A drawer opened beneath the table with a mechanical hiss. Inside was a sealed dossier, a biometric key fob, and a handwritten letter. And then Elise told me the truth. My grandfather, Frank Whitfield, had spent the last 22 years building something called the Remembrance Foundation. On the surface, it was a philanthropic organization supporting overlooked veterans, particularly those who had served in intelligence and covert operations and had been abandoned by the system. Beneath the surface, it was a financial and intelligence infrastructure of staggering scope. Secure communications networks, legal defense funds, medical support channels, whistleblower protections, and its total assets were valued at approximately $2.5 billion. My mouth went dry. My hands, those steady Navy hands, began to tremble. "This is not simply an inheritance," Elise said carefully. "This is a transfer of command." There was a vault 3 floors below us, not a bank vault, a server vault, climate-controlled, electromagnetically shielded, with enough encrypted data storage to rival a small intelligence agency. Frank had built it over 2 decades, brick by digital brick, and he had named one successor: me. I opened his letter with shaking fingers. His handwriting was the same as always, sharp and slanted, written with the fountain pen he'd carried since Korea. "Nora, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you're exactly where I need you to be. Everything I built because I watched good people get forgotten. You were one of them. But you were never forgotten by me. What I'm giving you isn't money. It's a mission. The Foundation protects those who protected us. You are the only person I trust to continue it. Be careful. The danger is closer than you think. Look at the U.S. accounts first. I'm sorry for what you'll find. Love, Grandpa." I read those words 4 times. My throat burned. I pressed the letter against my chest and breathed. Have you ever received something so enormous, so unexpected that your brain simply refused to process it? That's where I was. sitting in a windowless room in Zurich, holding a dead man's letter, realizing that the person who had always seen me had just handed me the keys to something monumental. I spent 3 weeks in Zurich learning the Foundation's architecture. I audited accounts, reviewed trust structures, and met with a small team of attorneys and analysts Frank had personally vetted. Then I turned my attention to the U.S. branch, exactly as he'd instructed. That's when the floor fell out from under me. The U.S. accounts showed systematic financial siphoning. Someone had been redirecting foundation funds into shell companies for at least 3 years, but that wasn't the worst of it. Buried inside the data was evidence that the private medical records and classified service files of over 2 million American veterans had been packaged and sold to entities with documented ties to foreign intelligence services, and the digital fingerprints on every transaction, every access log, every authorization code pointed to credentials registered under one name: mine. Someone had used my Navy encryption credentials to authorize the transfers. Someone had set me up as the fall guy for what amounted to espionage and treason. I traced the shell companies back through 4 layers of corporate obfuscation. At the bottom, a name I recognized, a consulting firm registered in Delaware, owned by Richard Whitfield, my father. I sat in that server vault, 3 stories underground in Zurich, staring at my father's name on a screen, and I felt something I had never felt before. Not pain, not sadness. Rage. Pure, cold, crystalline rage. Then I found the video file. Grandpa Frank recorded 6 months before his death, sitting in this very room. He looked tired. He looked angry. And he looked directly into the camera and said, "Nora, I sent you here because Richard cannot reach you here. He's been stealing from the Foundation for years, and he's been selling the identities of the people we swore to protect. He framed you because you were the easiest target, the child he made sure nobody would believe. I'm giving you everything because you're the only one who can stop him. Don't let him win." The next morning, I woke up with fire in my chest, but my hands were steady again. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to earn my father's approval. I was preparing to dismantle his lies. I was done being invisible. It was time to fight. Months passed. I returned to the United States quietly, setting up operations through the Foundation's secure legal network. I hired a forensic accounting firm out of Washington, D.C. I retained 2 former federal prosecutors as private counsel. I built my case the way Grandpa Frank would have wanted, meticulously, silently, and without a single wasted move. But my father wasn't idle. 3 months after the funeral, Richard and Blair launched their offensive. Blair posted a tearful video on social media claiming I had stolen Grandpa Frank's estate using forged documents. My father gave an interview to a local news outlet in which he called me emotionally unstable and implied I had gone AWOL from the Navy. A family attorney sent a cease and desist letter demanding I surrender all access codes and digital credentials related to the Whitfield estate. The phone calls started. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, suddenly concerned, suddenly asking pointed questions about bank accounts and passwords. My mother left a single voicemail. Her voice was flat and rehearsed. "Nora, your father says you need to come home and sort this out. He says if you don't cooperate, he'll have you arrested." My old self would have crumbled. My old self would have flown home, sat at that dining table and tried to explain. Tried to be heard. Tried to prove I wasn't what they said I was. But I wasn't my old self anymore. I called one person. Commander Diane Holt, retired, my former superior officer and the closest thing I had to a mentor outside of Grandpa Frank. I told her everything. She listened for 45 minutes without interrupting. When I finished, she said something I'll never forget. "Nora, you've spent your entire life trying to decrypt your father's love. Some codes don't have solutions. They're just noise. You already know your answer. Would you let any foreign operative frame you for treason and walk free? Then why would you let your father do it?" She was right. I already knew. I began feeding verified evidence packets to 3 federal agencies simultaneously: the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, the Department of Defense Inspector General, the Veterans Affairs Office of Accountability. Every packet was encrypted, sourced, and cross-referenced with Foundation records that Grandpa Frank had preserved specifically for this purpose. He had anticipated his own son's betrayal. He had built the evidence locker before he built the Foundation itself. If you've ever wondered whether doing the right thing feels heroic, let me tell you, it doesn't. It feels lonely. It feels terrifying. There were nights in my apartment in Arlington when I sat on the kitchen floor and cried. Not because I doubted what I was doing, but because I was grieving. Grieving the father I wished I'd had. Grieving the family I'd spent 31 years auditioning for. Grieving the little girl who once sat at that 9-bedroom dinner table and just wanted someone to say, "We're proud of you." But grief doesn't mean you stop. What would you do if the person who was supposed to protect you turned out to be the one you needed protection from? Drop your answer below. 6 months after I returned from Zurich, Richard escalated. He filed a formal complaint with the Department of Justice, naming me as the primary suspect in the veterans' data breach. He submitted my old Navy credentials as evidence. He had Blair record a sworn statement claiming she had witnessed me accessing Grandpa Frank's files suspiciously at the funeral. They thought they had me cornered. They thought I would panic. Instead, I initiated Protocol Daylight, a global encrypted broadcast through the Foundation's secure network. In one simultaneous release, I transmitted irrefutable evidence to every relevant federal authority, to 14 verified journalists, and to a secure public archive. Contracts bearing my father's signature, bank ledgers showing the shell company transfers, recorded phone calls in which Richard discussed pricing for the veterans' data with intermediaries, and Grandpa Frank's final video testimony naming Richard directly. The evidence was overwhelming. It was undeniable. And it was everywhere. Federal agents arrived at Richard's Crestwood estate on a Tuesday morning. I watched the footage later. He was in his robe, coffee in hand, when they came through the front door with a warrant. Blair was screaming in the background. My mother stood at the top of the stairs, frozen, holding the banister with both hands. She didn't look surprised. She looked like a woman who had been holding her breath for 30 years and had finally run out of air. The trial lasted 4 months. The prosecution presented evidence of financial fraud, unauthorized access to classified databases, and conspiracy to sell protected information to foreign-linked entities. Richard's defense tried to argue that Grandpa Frank had orchestrated everything posthumously to frame his own son. The jury didn't buy it. Richard Whitfield was convicted on 11 counts and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Knowing he was behind bars should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like closing a book I never wanted to read. Not triumph, just truth. I wondered whether I would ever stop wishing the story had been different. 2 years have passed since the trial. I live in a brownstone in Georgetown now, close to the Foundation's U.S. Operations Center. My mornings start early. Coffee, a run along the Potomac, and then I'm at my desk by 7, reviewing grant applications, coordinating with legal teams, and building something that matters. The Remembrance Foundation now operates in 9 countries. We've restored the compromised records of every veteran my father exposed. Every single one. It took 14 months, 200 volunteers, and a level of coordination that would have made Grandpa Frank proud. I know because I talk to him sometimes, in my head, when I'm driving or when the office is quiet. I tell him what we've done. I ask him if it's enough. He never answers, but I keep asking. The crown jewel is the Frank Whitfield Academy, a training center for veterans transitioning into ethical cybersecurity careers. We opened the first campus in Richmond. The second is under construction in San Diego. Every graduate takes an oath that Grandpa Frank wrote years before he died. It reads, "I will protect those who cannot protect themselves. I will never sell trust. I will see in the dark so others can live in the light." The first graduating class was 42 veterans. I spoke at the ceremony. My voice cracked twice. Nobody minded. Commander Holt sits on the Foundation's advisory board now. She calls me weekly. She still doesn't sugarcoat anything. Last month, she told me my public speaking needed work. Then she told me Frank would be proud. I cried in my car for 10 minutes after that call. Not all the wounds have healed. 6 months ago, I received a letter. Not from my father. From Blair. It was handwritten, which surprised me. Blair hadn't handwritten anything since elementary school. The letter was 4 pages long. It started with an apology, moved into self-justification, circled back to another apology, and ended with a request. She wrote that my father's health was declining in prison. Hypertension, early signs of kidney failure. She wrote that my mother had moved to a small apartment in Monterey and rarely left the house. She wrote that the family's reputation was destroyed, that her own marriage was under strain because her husband's firm didn't want the association. And then she asked me to visit Richard. He asks about you, Blair wrote. Not every day, but sometimes. He says he wants to explain. I think he wants to apologize. I think seeing you would help him. I think it would help all of us heal. I sat with that letter for 3 days. The old Nora would have gone. The old Nora would have driven to that prison, sat across from her father in a plastic chair, and listened to whatever version of the truth he had constructed. The old Nora would have nodded and said, "I understand." Because the old Nora believed that love meant absorbing other people's pain, no matter how much of it they'd caused. But I'm not her anymore. I wrote Blair back, 1 page. Blair, I hope Dad gets the medical care he needs. I genuinely do. I've contacted the prison's medical advocacy office to ensure he's receiving proper treatment, and I've arranged for an independent physician to review his case. But I am not able to be the person who visits. I am not able to sit across from him and listen to an explanation for why he sold the identities of people who served this country, or why he framed his own daughter to cover it. I have spent 2 years building something that protects the people he endangered. That is my answer. That is my closure. I don't need his apology to be whole. I already am. Dad still has you. He still has Mom. I did not take his family from him. I just stopped letting him take everything from me. I wish you peace, Blair. I mean that. She didn't write back. My mother called once, about a month later. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. She asked how I was. I told her I was well. She paused for a long time, and then she said, "Your grandfather always said you were the strongest one." I didn't know what to do with that, so I just said, "Thank you, Mom." She said goodbye. I haven't heard from her since, and strangely, I'm okay with that. Not happy, not relieved, just okay. There is a framed photo on my desk at the foundation. It's me and Grandpa Frank, taken the day he drove me to the recruiting office. I'm 17. I'm terrified, and he's standing beside me with his hand on my shoulder, looking at the camera like he already knew where this road would lead. I used to think inheritance was about money, about who gets the house, the stocks, the name on the trust. But the real inheritance, the one that matters, isn't in a bank vault in Zurich or a courtroom in California. It's in the letter a grandfather writes that says, "I see you." It's in the choice to protect strangers because someone once protected you. It's in the moment you stop decrypting someone else's approval and start encoding your own worth. So after everything you've heard, if you were standing where I am now, with your own father asking you to visit him in prison, to hear his explanation, to offer your forgiveness so he could feel better, would you go and call it healing, or would you send the letter and call it freedom? I know my answer now. It took me 31 years. A funeral, a plane ticket, a silver card with 1 word on it, and a grandfather who loved me enough to hide a billion-dollar mission inside a single envelope. I hope you find your answer faster than I did, but if you don't, that's okay too. Some codes take time. And that's where Nora's story ends. Not with revenge, not with bitterness, but with a woman who finally stopped begging for a seat at a table that was never built for her, and built her own instead. If this story hit you, if it made you think about someone in your life who never saw your worth, then do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment below telling me your answer to that final question. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story tonight, share it. Because sometimes the story that saves someone isn't their own, it's yours. I'll see you in the next one. And remember, some codes take time, but the ones worth cracking, they always lead to freedom. Until next time, stay strong, stay seen, and never let anyone tell you what you're worth.